Yeah. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jamali Bridge Podcast. And you are seeing me, Eram Saeed, and my co-host, Chris Atwood. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, Leena El Ali, the author of a wonderful book called No Truth Without Beauty. And we're going to be talking to her today. And as we got started, we were just singing happy birthday to Lena because it is going to be her birthday tomorrow as we're recording this. So happy birthday, Lena.
Thank you.
And we just learned that Lena shares a birthday with Mahatma Gandhi. So I was just sharing that I'm currently in India, and whatever one's religion is, I think Gandhi represents the search for freedom and peace, and that particularly that inner peace that all of us are looking for, all of us search for. So, Lena, thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you for being born on this day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Chris, we were just talking about this earlier too, that you are in India right now, and tell us where you're going to be. Where do you live?
Well, I asked you that. I liked your answer.
My answer was Lena asked Chris, where does Chris live? And Chris said, well, where do I live, Eram? And the only thing I can say with surety is that he lives on planet Earth. That's guaranteed.
That's true.
Beyond that, I never know.
Yeah. So my family is based, my wife is German, so our family is based in Germany. But this year, through next spring, we decided to bring our family on an adventure. So we are currently in the Himalayas in northern India, and we'll be visiting Nepal. I'll be teaching courses over the coming months in China and Japan, and then we'll be returning to Europe in the spring. But we're all very excited, and I get the opportunity to homeschool my children during this year, which I really love. So
yeah. And one of my dreams, Lena, is to have Chris speak at one of my events, either in Pakistan or in Dubai or Turkey or something like that. I think that would be wonderful, and maybe you can join us for those too. There was a time when Chris visited me while I was living in Pakistan. So he has visited Pakistan, and he got to meet my family, and everybody fell in love with him and couldn't get enough of him.
And vice versa, I might say.
Chris, you always love everybody, and you love every place you go. I don't think I've ever found you to say, yeah, I went to this place and I hated it. I don't think that's And Lena, I don't know if I think I have told you, but Chris has been my personal mentor for over a decade. This guy literally changed my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about, may I ask a question of Lena, Eram? Is it okay?
Of course. Yeah.
So you've written a book which sounds amazing, called No Truth Without Beauty. Will you tell us what led you to write a book that brings truth and beauty together?
Well, first of all, again, thank you so much for having me on this call. I'm so happy to meet you, Chris, even though it's virtual. And Eram, thank you once again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for being with us.
I come from Lebanon, and I grew up in the 70s. I came of age in the 70s, early 80s, thereabouts. And at the time, I was born into a Muslim family, lived in a Muslim context, if you will. And at the time, people were very comfortable with their Islam. Nobody really questioned anybody about their faith. Nobody expected us to prove our faith in any kind of way, certainly not by how we dressed or how we spoke or how we lived. It was just, there. It was in the environment. And that was very beautiful. But at the time, I didn't realize how beautiful that was until things changed. And I think things began to change, without getting too much into the geopolitics of it. But I think it's now generally accepted. And there's a great book on this subject, which I can mention in a second. I think with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then the subsequent sort of Saudi reaction to it that started this rivalry, if you will, between these two countries in terms of, who speaks for Islam, who represents Islam, etc. Saudi Arabia representing the majority, 90% of the Muslim world, which is Sunni, and Iran representing the 10% of the Muslim world, that is Shia. So this rivalry took the form it took many forms. One of the forms in which it took was in these two powers sort of vying with each other over who is more conservative, who is stricter, who takes Islam more seriously, etc., etc. And what that led is to a change in their cultures within each of these countries. And then, of course, each of them was trying to export its version across the region and beyond to the rest of the Muslim world. And as things got exported, you started to see greater and greater homogeneity in Muslim countries in all sorts of things, but the most visible way you would see this homogeneity was in how women started to dress. So whereas before, for example, in countries such as the Maldives, beautiful islands, great nature, white sand, blue seas, oceans, traditionally very colorful outfits, beautiful, and and this has always been Islam. Wherever Islam went, people took the core tenets of the faith and then adapted them to fit their. Oh, we lost Chris. I thought he had frozen for a while.
I think if you keep talking,
all right,
once he joins, we'll take it out of editing.
So you started to see in different parts of the world people abandon their traditional clothing, the way they used to dress, which in every case was beautiful. It was congruent with the environment, of course, because that's how clothing works. It reflected their history, their culture, and you started to see a greater and greater uniformity in how people dressed. And it tended to be, it tended to veer towards black, towards more and more sort of covering and so on. And so with that also came a greater sort of strictness in how people spoke about faith, their faith, and how they expected one to live. Here we are.
You're back, Chris. You're muted, though. You're muted. There you go.
Sorry that I left you. I didn't mean
It's
to.
okay. This is what happens when you're up in the Himalayas, so it's expected. It's cool. So we continued, as Lena was just talking about how the outer expression, outer clothing of women changed. Are you not able to hear Chris? He's frozen again.
He's frozen again, yes.
So let me pause it. There we go.
So we were talking about how things started to get more and more homogeneous, and in the most obvious way, the most apparent way, that things started to become the same all over the Muslim world was in how women started to dress, abandoning their own traditional clothing, which would always be very congruent with their environments, right?
And their culture and their heritage.
And their culture and their heritage and their history, and gradually they would take on sort of a more sort of usually black, but
Austere, very austere.
stricter and stricter clothing, and all those beautiful. I mean, if you look at the costumes of Yemen, for example, the traditional costumes of Yemen, I mean, they are breathtaking. Morocco, everywhere, the Maldives, etc. And so that was the most kind of visually obvious way in which things started to change, but also everything else started to change. One was suddenly expected to even speak differently, in a more serious manner, and somehow, like, even the smiling started to fade because we were now serious Muslims. And this was very noticeable for me, someone who had grown up in the 70s and early 80s, where people were so comfortable with their religious identity alongside their national identity and cultural identity. And of course, things just got more and more complicated there politically and geopolitically. And of course, September 11 brought all of this out into the public domain in a much bigger way. So now we're on the global stage where we're seeing all of this happen. And for someone who grew up loving the religion that she was born in, finding great comfort and inspiration in it, it's been heartbreaking. It's been heartbreaking because I had always associated it with beauty, and of course the truth has to be beautiful because God must be beautiful. Why would we love him if he weren't?
Of course.
Yeah, and of course I say him here just for convenience because God is beyond gender, right? But I don't like it and they for God. So it's it was.
God forbid if you say she.
Oh no, we can't do that.
Yeah, I know. So what does no truth without beauty mean to you?
It means that before we accept something as Islamic or inspired by the Quran or the Prophet or by this religion, because people make claims all the time, before we accept anything, we must hold it up to examine more closely in the light of the Quran. And if it's beautiful, then it's likely to be true. But if it's ugly, how can anything ugly come from God? And if we think God is capable of ugliness, why would we believe in him and love him and worship him to begin with? So there's a dissonance there that I wanted to try and highlight. And a lot of people, their instincts tell them this, but they are prevented by their environments and the circumstances that they find themselves in. They are prevented from following through on that gut feeling that they have, which is, if it's ugly and harsh and cruel and unpleasant, and it makes me fearful all the time and makes me feel guilty all the time and whatnot, then surely it cannot come from God. And my hope is that people begin to follow through more. And the internet has been great for that because it's made all kinds of sources of information and whatnot available to more and more people. So hopefully, I hope that more and more people will take comfort in knowing that there are others who have this feeling inside that they're not quite sure what to do with or make of. And feel that they should explore it a little bit more and really hold up. I mean, it's a litmus test of sorts. If it's not beautiful, it's not from God, and take it from there. At least that should be or could be the first step in what could unfold into a beautiful, nourishing, nurturing spiritual journey.
Oh my God, this was so beautiful. Thank you,
It
Lena.
is.
Can I comment, Chris? And then I would love for you to comment, because this was bringing up so much for me. Because a couple of things I want to say, Lena. the first thing it was bringing up for me was Chris has seen me for the major part of my journey back towards Islam, finding the truth, understanding some of the truth and the answers. And this was the way Chris used to tell me was, when something creates separation. So that's how Chris describes it, what you call beauty. So when something creates separation, where you're feeling separate from God, either you're not understanding the scripture correctly, or something else is going on, or your understanding of what's being said is different, right? So something else is creating separation. God's message should not make you feel separate from God. So we used to, Chris and I would actually read the Quran together a lot of times, because if I was stuck on something, and of course, Lena, we have several translations. And so if there was a version of a translation that I was stuck on, like, why is God saying this? And he appears so harsh here. And Chris would help me to understand. It's like, no. I don't think that's what God is saying here. What if you looked up this meaning and perhaps, so I actually started realizing that, oh yeah, this is just a different interpretation, and I would discuss it with Chris. And our test was this: if it makes me feel separate from God, something is off. And then, as you can see, me, Chris, something so beautiful about what Lena was saying. Beauty has been one of my highest values in life. And that is why I have the Jamali brand, which Lena very kindly pointed out to me, because I'm not a native Arab speaker, right? So Jamal is so in Islam, we feel, especially in Sufism, we're told that there are two main attributes of God. Of course, there are several, but one is Jamal, one is Jalal. So Jamal is called, it's beauty, and it's the more feminine aspect, more feminine attribute of God. And Jalal is it's grandeur, it's magnificence, and that's the more masculine aspect of God. So if you were taking Urdu, Jamali would mean beauty. And then Lena kindly pointed out to me that, in Arabic, Jamali would mean my beauty. So,
that's a good one.
Either way, it doesn't matter whether it's my beauty or just beauty in general. But beauty has been, and still is, a very high value for me as well. So this has been such a beautiful, alignment, that two Muslim women who grew up in different parts of the world and then found their answers kind of took the same litmus test to test whether this was truth,
Yeah. And Lena, I think it's such a deep and powerful insight that you've had, that if it comes from God, it must be beautiful. Because one of the things that I know that I found in my life, and really it's become so clear, that when we sort of clear away all the concepts of our society, of our religion, of our culture, of our traditions, when you clear all those away, what you're left with is a life that is intended to be steps of increasing joy. This is my experience, and those steps of increasing, why would God create an earth and a planet and human beings who are here to suffer? What's the point of that? The whole point is for us to be able to open up to experience, as Eram was saying, that what God is, that infinite joy, infinite beauty, infinite creativity, infinite intelligence, is not separate from us, but we are a part of it. We are not that in the sense of this small person. The small person is not that, but we are a part of that. And when we experience that as being all there is, which is ultimately what God is, you can't think, I don't know of any major religion in the world that doesn't, including Islam, from my understanding from Eram, that doesn't hold God to be omnipresent. If God is omnipresent, is that true, Lena? Actually, let me ask you, is it true from the Muslim perspective that God is omnipresent?
It is absolutely true. He is omnipresent, omniscient, omni, whatever you choose to continue with. However, I have to confess that one of the things that I personally feel has happened over the course of the last 40 odd years, because of these geopolitical shifts that started this trend that we're still living in. One of the things I've noticed is that in the mainstream of Islam, meaning, your average person, say in whatever country or whatever community, I think there has tended to be, because of this increased austerity, I think there's tended to be a greater and greater emphasis in our understanding of God as transcendent at the expense of God being immanent.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I want to say that again, because I think it's in a slightly different way, because it's a really important point. We have tended to move our societies away from the fact that religion is meant to be a pathway to God, so that he would see it fit to draw us near, in the language of the Quran. Instead of focusing on that, the emphasis has become on sort of worshiping him and being sort of constantly thinking about how transcendent and somewhat unapproachable he is.
Right.
It's very subtle, but it's crept in to the point that, I think a lot of people go through the motions of the faith, that the faith requires, the pillars of the do's and the don'ts. Yeah. But this reflection on what it means, what is the ultimate purpose, I think a lot of that has been diluted.
I think that is such a beautiful thought, Lena. And Chris,
I do too.
If you can say it in your words too, because you're so good at that. You're so good at putting really abstract thoughts into beautiful words.
Well, I think what has happened in Islam, but also in other religions as well, is that we've put God out here somewhere, and then God will punish me if I don't do everything just right? If I don't follow all of the doctrines and prescriptions, then I'm going to be punished. And so then God becomes something to be feared, right? God is dangerous to me because are any human beings perfect? Do we all follow every prescription exactly? And even if we do, does that mean that we have achieved the purpose of those things? And so I know this was one of the things that Eram, you struggled with.
Very much.
Because I know that when you were growing, maybe you can speak about that a little bit, because I know when we first got together, one of the things that you were really kind of pushing back against was this idea that you didn't want God anymore because he was this punisher, right? Something of that nature. And I think, and maybe both of you can comment on this from your own experience, but it seems to me that there are many Muslims that have developed this concept that God is dangerous, in a sense. God is the punisher. Eram, do you want to speak to that?
Well, thank you. Yes. So beautiful what you said, Lena, because I think a lot of us don't even realize it, that there is that subtle difference, but we have bought into that conditioning so much, Lena, that not only is that the God is the punisher, because a lot of Muslims are taught that, taqwa, we're told in the Quran, Chris, that God doesn't distinguish anyone based on their race, their color, their gender, all of those things. But those of you that have more taqwa are dearer to God. And then how do you define taqwa? Simple, fear of God. And that didn't sit well with me. It's like, fear of God. Why does God want me to be afraid of him all the time? And then they'll do mental gymnastics to try to explain that to you, but it never really truly makes sense until much later I realized that taqwa, actually, the right definition is compassionate awareness of God. So anyway,
beautiful.
But what Lena was saying, thank you. We're told in the Quran to always follow the sirat-e-mustaqim, which means the right path. Is that the correct translation, Lena?
The straight path.
The straight path, thank you. The straight path. So we're supposed to be on the path. It never says, destination of mustaqim, that you have, you're supposed to achieve the destination. You're always supposed to be on the path. So this thing that Lena was talking about, that we think we're going to follow all these rituals, we're going to do all these things that we're supposed to do, all these rules and regulations, and then eventually God is going to either accept us or reject us, right? On the day of reckoning or whenever. But the truth of the matter is, what I have learned, and maybe this is what, Lena, you were alluding to, if you can comment on this, that you're actually, the sirat, the path, is when you're traveling with God. God is never separate from you. Yes, you may make decisions that will give you the feeling of separation. And that's when you feel pain. That's when you suffer. That's when you go into misery. So what I discovered on this journey with Chris was that, wow, no, I don't have to wait for the day that I die to find out whether God accepted me or not. God actually accepts me. And now it is up to me on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis to keep checking. Am I aligned, or did I just fall out of alignment? Am I aligned, or did I just fall? So my heaven or hell is right here in this moment, based on my choices that I made, which either brought me closer to God or they pushed me away from God. That's simple for me now. Is that what you were
And
talking about?
if I can just say, that's true for everyone. The closer we get to God, the more joy we experience. The farther the choices we make, the farther the choices we make take us away from God, the more we suffer. And this idea of God accepting us, God is always accepting us. God is always present. God never goes away. It's not like, oh, this idea, it's a very human idea that we're going to be judged. God actually doesn't, from my perspective, God doesn't judge us, right or wrong. There's just a structure of maybe the laws of nature, the structure of the universe that he's created, that when we make decisions that bring us closer to him, we experience more joy. When we take decisions that bring us farther away from him, we suffer. And when it sounds so simple, and to be honest with you, from my experience, it is really simple, but what gets in the way is all the concepts, interpretations, and ideas that have been built around the fundamental truth that exists in Islam and also in other religions, but exists there in Islam. But then it gets complicated and then it gets lost. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Lena.
Sure. So interesting what you've both just said. And there's just so much in there that I want to pick up on. Going to try and sort out my thoughts little by little. I think, Eram, you hit on something really important when you mentioned the word taqwa, which is traditionally translated as, fear of God. And in a more correct translation, there are different ways of saying it. You said, I think, conscious awareness, right?
Compassionate
Awareness. Compassionate awareness, compassionate consciousness. I was mixing the two. And another way of saying it would be reverent piety, to remain within the sort of language of the Quran. That's how Muslims would understand it, piety, reverence, piety that doesn't forget the reverence, the transcendent element. The transcendent element is very important to the Muslim psyche because of the reasons that we've just talked about. So, that really has impacted the way that our relationship has evolved with the divine over time. And so with regards to the punishment issue, I spoke about this on Eram's podcast the other day. One of the things that always struck me, so many things have always struck me in the Quran, the choice of wording I mean, it's very, very deliberate and very, very specific. And we often have to really stop and think, why? Why does it say that? And basically, what God says in the Quran with regards to sort of punishment if one does something bad, he says, it is not I who is harming you or oppressing you. It is you who is harming
That's
yourself.
right. Yes, exactly.
Who is oppressing yourself through the choices that you're making, because he gave us free will.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the great
Yeah.
gift. Free will. We're not created as robots. When we say, sometimes we hear people say we are servants of God or slaves of God, it's supposed to be voluntary. You know, we voluntarily pledge ourselves to you. It's voluntary slavehood or voluntary servitude.
Yes.
So that's really, really important, because God is reminding us, you know, all right, you know, he depicts awful in the Quran, like elsewhere in other scriptures, scary images of hell, etc., because it is awful what you inflict upon yourself. You know,
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
because you know, cause and consequence. You reap what you sow. We know this. We believe in this. All of us, whatever religion we come from, we believe in reaping what you sow. Some people say, in secular terms, what goes around comes around. You know, there's so many ways of articulating it. Karma. And so on. So I think that's a very, very important distinction or subtlety, and it's a nuance in the Quran that has, for the most part, been missed. I think, Eram, I don't know if you would agree that it's not much talked about, really. And this thing of separation, because you know, when we talk about separation from the divine, etc., and I'm mindful of you know, some Muslims who might be listening to this podcast, hopefully, because sometimes there's terminology that is perceived to be very Western, and it might be perceived as an importation, a foreign import, shall we say, into discussions of Islam. And what I want to remind our Muslim viewers is that in the Quranic worldview, if you will, you know, God is the creator of everything, right? He is behind everything. Nothing would exist without him. But that is not to say that he created evil, right? Evil is when we choose to move away from God.
That's right. Exactly.
And the goodness that he represents, because he is the sovereign good. It's our moving away from him and those values, those essentials. That's how evil arises. So that's the separation, essentially, that we talk about when we're in Western fora. You know, it's not different, it's the same thing, but we're just coming at it in slightly different ways.
Beautiful.
Different ways. It is beautiful. Can I comment, Eram? Because this gets me excited. I love this kind of discussion. And you know, if you think about God as the creation, Allah as creation of all things, right? Creation of all things. Then, and I love the way you described evil, but because what has made sense to me as my understanding has grown is that you can imagine Allah as the light, right? And that light, then, the farther one gets away from what God is, the light becomes less and less, less and less, less and less, until you have darkness, right? And that darkness is the absence of Allah, the absence of God. It's not something in and of itself. It's simply the absence of the light. And that is what evil is, right? Yeah. Evil is the absence of the light. And the other thing I loved that you said about this concept of taqwa as reverent piety, because just to tie it back to what I was saying, what one discovers as one's joy in life, as one becomes, if I can say, more and more immersed in the reality of what Allah is, joy increases. As joy increases, one's reverence naturally increases. Because when your joy increases, you feel grateful, gratitude, reverence. And piety, I think, is just describing the nature of being aligned with Allah, aligned with God, because God is piety, at least from my perspective. Maybe you can speak, both of you can speak to this. I may have a misunderstanding of it, but certainly reverence is that sense of I am.
Uh-oh. Chris, we lost your audio.
Oops.
Oh,
That, yeah. So my microphone changed, but forgive me for that. Can you still hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that growth of joy elicits gratitude. That gratitude naturally creates the desire to bow down to the reverence to that which has given rise to this experience. And how would you define piety, Eram or Lena? Lena, you were talking about it. How would you define it?
I wanted to make a quick comment here because I was interviewing Sitara Akram recently, another Muslim scholar, and she was talking about the early Islam, and she said, Islam was about piety in action. It was about these beautiful ethics and piety in action. She also said, the way she gave the example was that, Chris, as you know, you've seen me do it too. We have salat 5 times a day. We pray. So whenever Quran talks about salat, whenever Quran mentions salat, that, do your salat, immediately after that is the mention of zakat, which is to pay alms, which is to take care of the poor, the widows, the, charity. So whenever we're talking about salat, God is talking about salat, immediately after that, it is zakat, constantly. So this is piety in action. So for me, that is what it means when you talk about reverent piety. Another thing I wanted to make a quick comment on, which you both touched on, was how, light is the presence of God and evil is simply moving away from that and absence of light. And, I was thinking about my favorite verse from the Quran, I've told you many times, Chris, is Allahu nurus samawati wal ard, which means God is the light between heavens and earth. So, you can kind of see that Quran is confirming this, that, yeah, God is that light when you start moving away from light, and when to the degree that it becomes absent, that's to the degree that you have evil, lack of goodness. So, Lena.
On the question of piety, our relationship with God, and my understanding of the Quran, cannot be separated from our having a sense of awe when it comes to Him.
Yes.
I think the awe is twofold, because it makes us humble, and so we come down to earth, we're humble, we worship Him, we bow our heads, we're pious. But the awe also makes us look up and around, and there's reverence in that looking up and around. And I think what we have lost is the ability to marry the two all the time. We are either so focused on being pious, because we want to obey, we want to do, we want to, conform. And we're often forgetting to really look up and around and absorb, and marrying the two things. I mean, God Himself says, I am beyond everything. I am like, you can't even conceive of me. Your minds are not able to kind of wrap your head around me, but I'm also closer to you than your jugular vein.
Vein, that's right, exactly.
Can I say something here? I just want to share something really profound. Lena, this is so beautiful what you're talking about. Thank you. Do either one of you know who Hans Zimmer is, the musician? Hans Zimmer?
You just went to a concert by him.
Yes, you saw it on my Facebook. Yes. He is amazing, Chris. So He is an incredible, incredible musician. He did the score for, God, any big movie, you name it. The Last Samurai. He just recently did the Dune. He's done Gladiator, Top
Wow.
Gun. Okay, he's done all those scores. He is just brilliant. It is a treat to watch him live. So I happened to go there last week, and so we've got this full orchestra, right? And there's this one piece. He was gonna start The Last Samurai, but before that, he starts with this piece. I don't remember what the name of the instrument is. I think it's dudek or something. It's an ancient instrument which kind of looks like a flute, sounds like a flute, but is way more incredible. It was a 3,000-year-old instrument. So this guy
Wow.
starts playing, and it is so beautiful. It just, stirred my soul. It was actually, I apologize, I think it was from Inception, the movie Inception. Anyway, so I'm flowing with the music, as you know, Chris, that happens to me. And Lena, I feel this stirring in my soul. I close my eyes, and my soul, I feel, has just, gone up somewhere in the universe and is floating around. I feel so connected to God, right? And Chris knows that, I call God my best friend, as you know that too, Lena. And he's my buddy. And I can see the beauty of the universe and how expansive it is. And I'm just like floating around, so deeply touched. Tears were running down my face. And I'm, with my buddy having fun in the universe. And then suddenly it hit me. Like suddenly I'm like, oh my God, look how magnificent and grand and expansive and sophisticated and just so freaking awesome this universe is. And I started to tremble with what I would call habit in Arabic, habit, when you're like, it's so grand that you're almost afraid. Like it's breathtaking. The grandeur is just awe-inspiring, right? So we call it, I think, habit in Urdu. I don't know what it's called in Arabic. And because I suddenly realized that this being that I call my buddy, my best friend, is not just the creator of all of this. He owns all of this, is the maintainer of all of this. And it is through his mercy that he's given me this right to call him my best friend, but he's actually a really, really powerful being. And, so I was just experiencing this awe, and at the same time, this trembling, like I am in the presence of, or I am, experiencing absolute magnificence and just grandeur, like, wow. And so they were both simultaneous. So for me, and in that moment, I said, that's taqwa. For me, it was like, that's taqwa, because I still love him, but I also am somewhat fearful of the immensity of what I just realized. So that's kind of what I experienced.
It's
Beautiful.
beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. For me, that was taqwa.
I wanted to make one point and then ask another question of you, Lena, if I may. The as Eram just described in her experience of awe, in my own experience, awe is a spontaneous thing that happens when we find ourselves in the presence of God, in the presence of Allah. It's not something we have to try and create. In fact, I don't think we can create it. It
Yeah.
happens when we find ourselves in the presence of that, of that immensity that Allah is. And then the other thing, and I think the same thing is true of reverent piety, to be pious. I think one of the misunderstandings from my perspective is that we have to try to be pious. Piety is something that happens spontaneously and naturally as we become more and more aligned with Allah, with God, with the will of God. And the other side of that, the other part of that, from my perspective, is that the more we align with the will of God, the more this idea of being a slave or a servant is not my decision. it's the spontaneous result of my bowing down and having no choice but to be in the floating of moving in the will of God, to move in the will of Allah. That when I am so completely surrendered to that, then you could say I'm a slave, you could say I'm a servant, but the truth of the matter is I'm just present as God moves, as Allah moves me, because I'm a slave, but there is no longer, in some sense, there is no longer me. There's just Allah moving. And that appears like a slave. See, the reason I say that is because, certainly in Western culture, the concept of slave has a negative connotation, right?
And that's why I
And
brought it up earlier, and to emphasize the voluntary aspect of it, because at that point it's an expression of love.
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, but and also I would even go so far as there comes a point where it's not even voluntary. It's all I can do because I am so in love with Allah, so in love with God. I have no choice. I can't do anything else except bow down, to surrender, to just lay myself at the feet of this magnificent, magnificent Father, parent, all creator, whatever name we give to that beautiful, amazing thing that Allah is. I have no choice. There's nothing else but that for me any longer, and then to me that's truly being a slave of God. It's not, I'm volunteer, forgive me, I'm not criticizing, but I'm just saying it's not even a voluntary choice. Okay, I want to be the servant or the slave of God. No, I have to surrender. Everything else brings me suffering, brings me unhappiness. I just surrender. Let your will be done, right? Let thy will, not my will, be done, right?
I get it completely. It's voluntary, not in terms of the will making a decision that it follows up on. It's voluntary in the sense that it's a spontaneous outburst of love, and it can be no other way. I
Exactly.
get what you're saying. I totally
Yeah,
agree.
yeah, exactly. So I I would love for you, if we can enter a slightly controversial part
Yes,
of
let's do that.
Islam, that, I wonder how do you feel? It appears that there's a contradiction in the way the Quran has been interpreted, so that the beauty of men can be displayed, but the beauty of women the physical beauty of women at least must be covered up. And is it possible that the covering of women's physical beauty may be a misinterpretation of the Quran, or how do you view it?
Yes, no, that's a very good question, and it has a pretty straightforward answer. It is an interpretation that gives precedence to cultural preferences over what the Quran was actually saying. And this has been shown time and again by a large number of scholars, especially contemporary scholars. Because in the Quran itself, there is tremendous symmetry. We started off talking a little bit about symmetry. There is symmetry in the Quran with regards to men and women. Either a verse will address both groups together, the female and the male together, or the Quran will address an issue to men and it will address the same issue to women, where there's something slightly different that God wants to say. For example, we hear a lot about lower your gaze for women. Well, it starts off, there are two consecutive verses. One says to men, lower your gaze, and the next one says to women, lower your gaze. There's a symmetry there. But we focus completely on the second verse that relates to women, and then we get into all kinds of contortions over that. Other concepts, for example, adultery is addressed in which is nushuz, or extramarital affairs, shall we say, because it's a bit complicated. But anyway, so it addresses the same the issue. It addresses men and it addresses women, because there are slightly different circumstances. around men and women, going back to the customs of the day where men could have more than one wife. So, it still addresses it with regards to, well, what if men do it? It doesn't say, well, men, they can have more than one wife, which was the custom of the day. It was not something that the Quran introduced. Actually, the Quran limited it and tried to do away with it. So there's this constant either speaking to both men and women at the same time, or when there need to be slight differences in approaches, it will always maintain that symmetry. And so, it's really extraordinary, because men have interpreted these verses, even though the first of the two says to men, lower your gaze and be respectful, and don't sort of, you do not have a carte blanche with regards to women. Men have interpreted this to mean basically you can ogle women to your heart's content, and in fact do more than that if they make themselves, visible to you. Mm-hmm. That's how they have essentially interpreted it. So it's the onus is placed on the woman to hide herself so that a man may not ogle her or grope her or whatnot. Mm-hmm. So it's really very, very unfortunate. But I'm just remembering now that the most fundamental, I think, verse or set of verses that speak to humankind, men and women, as God's representatives on earth. That verse places equal responsibility on men and women in building up their societies. It doesn't say, oh, men, you go build up society, and women, you follow the rules that men establish. It's no, God, assigns this incredibly important mission to build up your societies, preserve the earth, the environment, etc. It is the responsibility of both of you, and you are to be counselors to one another, and sounding boards to one another, and support to one another, supporters of one another as you go about being my representatives on earth. So, it's really extraordinary to go from these noble, lofty expressions of what God had in mind for men and women on earth as his representatives to these petty interpretations that get us talking about, if the neck should also be covered, or,
Yes.
is up to the chin all right, or is a lock of hair falling out. I mean, it's really just very, very, very disappointing.
Yeah.
Well, and if I may, from a non-Muslim's perspective, and from having spoken to many non-Muslims in today's world because of events that have happened over the last, 20, 30, 40 years, I hate to say it, but a woman wearing full dress, burqa or something, is viewed as a threat in the West. What does she have under those robes? What danger does she represent to the rest of us? Which is sort of the opposite of religion, from my perspective. It's just, and this is not the fault of Muslims. It's not the fault of Islam, certainly, but it has created, and I think this is one of the reasons why Eram wanted to have this podcast, is it's created this rift, this division between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, where for many people who are not informed or not knowledgeable, many people who are not Muslims know very little about Islam. And as a result, given, the various things that have happened in the past years, Islam is often viewed, generally, Muslims are viewed as a threat. And personally, one of the reasons I agreed to participate in this is because I think that really is harmful to our world. And this is a rift that needs to be healed. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, Lena.
Yes, thank you. It's we always fear what we don't know and what we don't understand. And of course, this manner of dressing is something that is very difficult for, by the way, not just the Western mind to understand. I will tell you that not even my grandmothers not even my grandmothers had heard the word niqab or burqa, or what is the other, purda, depending on the language. We had not heard of this word. We didn't know what it meant, because in their day, that was not a thing. And this is something that surprises the West. Because nowadays, it used to be that some women would wear a headscarf to cover their hair. And at the time, like when I was growing up and my mother was growing up and my grandmothers were growing up, that was, there was some, but actually they were a minority who actually wore a headscarf. But it was a choice, and nobody questioned them for doing it or for not doing it. It was perfectly respected as a choice. It was not put under the microscope by anybody in the Muslim world. The West has always been very tolerant about live and let live. This is a personal choice. But now, of course, it's taken on a whole new thing, even as that way of dressing, let's call it a conservative way of dressing, has been evolving itself to become more and more strict and some would argue downright bizarre, and utterly impractical as well.
Yes.
So, I really have great sympathy for people who are fearful when they see, something totally covered up, black. It's associated with, in the Western mind, with the oppression of women, which it may and may not be. Sometimes it's a choice.
Yep.
And sometimes it's not, like what's happening in Afghanistan, for example.
Yeah.
Women are they're not allowed to get out of their homes. But now, from what I heard, a woman publicly speaking is not allowed because her voice could create lust in a man. So, they've literally taken their voices away too.
Yes.
So
It's so interesting how there's no responsibility in the man for that, right?
and that's what I was going to touch on. So what Lena talks about in her book, what other, lots of Muslim scholars are talking about it now. I'm, of course, interested in hosting more and more women scholars on my platform, but they are raising their voices that this was never meant to be such a strict ruling of the Quran. What the Quran says is, be modest, which is which is good for any society. Be modest. And technically, your private parts should be covered. For women, of course, it's the breasts and, genitalia, but for men, it's genital. So, and then you decide based on your culture and your environment, what is considered modest, and you go with that. And, so Quran understood, like when you actually understand the Quran, that God gave you a mind to think with, and Quran constantly reminds you of that use your brain, use your aql, which means your mind. So, God is treating you like adult, responsible human beings. That's why Quran says, lower your gaze to the men, lower your gaze to the women. So Quran is acknowledging that women are also sexual beings who could look at a man and get lustful thoughts, and a man could look at a woman and have lustful thoughts. So Quran is saying the right thing to do, and that's also good manners, is to lower your gaze. Don't stare, don't be obnoxious, don't do that. And so Quran actually did not place the onus on the women to not appear lustful to a man. Actually, that's a man's own responsibility, because if we saw it otherwise, what current scholarship has done, you would think, Chris, that women are these objects that if they appear in any form of expression or nudity, then men are not going to be able to control themselves and it's not their fault, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, men are animals. They cannot control their animal instincts, and God does not treat men or women like that. God gives a lot of dignity and respect to both the genders. So this is what it has done. It has not just harmed women in that it has oppressed them, this interpretation, but it has also harmed men, not only the way women view them, but also in the way now that they act sometimes. So, when you actually understand what the Quran is saying, you can see clearly that it is divine wisdom, and there's a lot of wisdom in it. But in no way, from when I did my research, and Lena's book was very helpful in this too, that no, in no way is Quran making a woman responsible for the bad behavior of men.
Yeah, well, and that's what you would expect for a book which speaks of truth,
And a book which is from the divine.
Yeah, exactly. And Lena, I know, or I understand at least, that you have thought deeply about the role of women and the teachings of the Quran. And I wonder if you would share with us what the conclusions are that you've come to, and why have you come to those conclusions? Because obviously the role of women in Islam seems to be a somewhat controversial subject somehow.
Yes. Yes. I mean, thank you for this question, because, one might be forgiven for thinking these days that most of the Quran is spent on women's issues and on putting women in a straitjacket. The public discourse is such that you would think, that's what the Quran is all about. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. So I want to begin answering your question by confessing that I came to women's issues late in life. Perhaps because of the time that I grew up in and the environment that I grew up in, I didn't really suffer too much from misinterpretations. I mean, sure, men had it easier, but nothing dramatic that I felt limited me in an egregious way, or that it was what it was. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't sort of traumatizing or anything like that. But as time went by, as things changed, and as I grew up and I traveled, etc., I started to realize, oh my God, this is a very, very big thing. And I hadn't really quite understood how big of a thing it had become. And it was in many parts of the world. So I shifted my attention to women's issues because I saw the need to understand it a bit more and try to help as possible. Because I grew up nobody taught me religion. It was just there. And I always say it was absorbed by osmosis. It was just there. And it's the best kind of way. You take it in, you adapt it to your personal psyche, you grow with it, you have a relationship with it. And I'm self-taught in that sense. But I realized that I had to look into it a little bit more, because as I was reading the Quran myself on my own over the years, I never paid too much attention, frankly, to the women's verses. I had other things on my mind. I was particularly fascinated with how the Quran, and this is a whole other topic, my big thing was always like, wow, the Quran spends so much time talking about other religions and validating them. Wow, this is amazing. So that was my thing. That was my little obsession. But then I realized, wait a minute, there's something much more important here. And that is what goes on within Muslim households. I can turn my attention to relationships with our neighbors of other religions later, but this is the big one. This is where you start. You start from within, right? Any change has to come from within. So that's when I started to pay more and more attention to women's issues. And I started to I was like, okay, I'm going to comb through the Quran, and I'm going to pull out all of the verses that mention women, and I'm going to line them all up, and I'm going to see the evidence for myself once and for all. I'm tired of hearing, that God says this and God says that with regards to women, and maybe I had missed them all because I was reading in a hurry or whatnot all these years. So I pulled them all out as part of the exercise, and I was absolutely astonished, because when you line them all up, all of the verses because there are verses that address men and women, as we said. And there are verses that are specific to women, and they're specific to women's issues. And what is interesting is that some of them come from God, but most of them come from people having asked questions of God through the prophet. People who are having asked the prophet for guidance on this issue or that issue. And therefore God comes along and responds through verses delivered to the prophet, which is what the Quran is. And so when you line them all up, you start to say, wait a minute, it's almost as if he was advocating for women. He was advocating for women on being recognized for their role in defending the community. He was advocating for women when it came to unfair divorce customs that existed at the time. He was advocating for women who spoke up and wanted to be recognized for their contribution to society through inheritance laws. And then he doesn't just advocate for them over the issues that they raise, women would raise very often, but he then goes further and he's integrating women into other aspects of life that they weren't otherwise involved in. For example, women can now be witnesses. This was unheard of. This was unheard of at the time. Women could be witnesses when an inheritance was being divvied up to its rightful owners. Women could be now be witnesses when a loan is taken out. In that case, it says if you don't find two men witnesses, you can get a man and two women witnesses. But it's because women at the time, for the most part, couldn't read and write, one. And secondly, because women, for the most part, did not take part in commerce and trade and loans and whatnot. And so the Quran, in this very long verse on witnesses when it comes to financial transactions, is saying from now on, when you contract a debt, write it down. We're going to start writing it down. We're not going to leave things to people's memories. We're going to start writing it down. And we're going to continue to have, we're going to have witnesses. And there it says, if you can't find two male witnesses of your choosing that you think are suitable for this task, then a man or two women is good enough. And so, God is integrating women into every aspect of social and economic life. And this verse has been made, a lot of, because it's, why is it two women and one man? And men have used that to say, oh, you have half a brain. That's why. They literally have, ask Eram, you have half a brain, and therefore they have expanded it so that women can only ever be half of a witness, or you need two women to make up a witness in everything. Whereas God only spoke about it specifically in the context of financial transactions. With all of the other situations he mentioned, the other four, he doesn't say, you need two women witnesses.
Yeah, and for some reason, this is actually a question that I get asked a lot from the West also. Why are you okay with the religion where they don't even consider you good enough to be a witness? And it's like, it was only for that specific thing. And that too, keeping in mind, we're talking about almost 1500 years ago, women all over the world were considered property of men. Even in America, it wasn't until 50 or 60 years ago that women could, own a bank account in their own name and, have a checkbook and stuff. They had to have it in their husband's name. So we're talking about almost 1500 years ago. And like what Lena said, God is integrating women even into this practice of commerce and trade, which for centuries still would remain to be something that is male dominated even for today. But God is integrating women into that. And because understandably, they may not understand it that well. So he's saying for support, for your moral support, you can bring another woman. And because we have to remember, Chris, that, I've spoken to you about this a lot. What Quran did was, it was radical that all over the world, women had never been told you're equal to men. women were considered property of men. And people like Aristotle, for example, the philosophers, actually considered women to be subhuman species, that they're so dumb and stupid they can't even be in nobility and everything, they're less. So Quran comes along and says, no, they're your equal. And they're free, they're not your property, they can inherit, they can own separate property, they have agency, they have autonomy. It was radical. However, you still have women who have lived and have been conditioned in that environment where they're going to feel nervous, right? So for their support, God is giving you a framework. Okay, this is where here we are now. We're integrating women into everything. And now you're supposed to go on this trajectory, and it's supposed to go this way. Unfortunately, it got hijacked after a few hundred years. And so this is not how it's been since forever. It's just a few hundred years ago that it got hijacked, and it's now like, yeah, women, you're not smart enough to give testimony, so it's going to be half in everything. You need two in everything. And that's actually not the case. Like, for example, I think in rape, it's just one woman's word, or if in case of divorce, it's the woman's word, and it doesn't matter. So I'll let you speak, Lena, because I get too impassioned when I start talking.
No, but this is very important commentary. Thank you. No, to round up what you're saying and this whole point, I mean, like with inheritance, it was absolutely revolutionary. Who ever heard of a woman inheriting in the 7th century? I mean, in Europe, it didn't become a thing till what, the early 20th century? And back then, in fact, you know, women were the subject the object of inheritance. In other words,
Yes.
men would even inherit women.
Yeah.
Men would inherit women. So here was the Quran coming along and saying, no, you know, actually, women are not going to be the object of inheritance anymore. They're going to be a subject of inheritance. They are going to be heirs as well. And this was absolutely revolutionary. And men were not very happy about it, and they resisted. Actually, this is documented.
What a surprise. I mean,
Yeah, what a surprise.
But
How could that be?
But also, what is interesting in this inheritance issue, is that it was the women who brought it up. It was advocacy.
Yeah.
By the women for themselves.
Yeah.
They got organized. They were activists, basically. They went off to the Prophet. They were like, listen, most of us aren't going off to battle to defend the tribe. It's true. Only a few women. There were some women who fought, and they were very famous warriors. Most of us are staying behind. But if we didn't stay behind, taking care of everything, if we didn't feed them, clothe them, take care of the property while they're off, would they be able to go off for battle? So we are contributing too, because the law in Arabia at the time was that only the male would inherit, because only the men were on the battlefield and defending the tribe. It was all connected, therefore, inheritance with the survival of the tribe. So they advocate for themselves. They become activists. They go to the Prophet. The Prophet is like, not so sure about this. But, you know, as he would always do, he wouldn't immediately pronounce upon a thing because, you know, he would be unsure, but then God would come along and instruct him. Mm-hmm. And so to round off my answer to your question, when you line up all of these issues, you suddenly think, oh my God, there's this thing in America called affirmative action. This sounds like affirmative action for women, but this happened back in the 7th century, and the men resisted it. They didn't like much of it, etc. But honestly, you come across thinking God was advocating for women, and he on the one hand responded to things that they brought up, and on the other, he integrated them into other things that they hadn't brought up, that they hadn't thought to question or raise. So we have something there that is absolutely sort of the inverse of what we've been given to understand by religious institutions today.
Yeah.
So I know we need to wrap up in about 10 minutes, but I want to ask one last question, Lena, if I may, that I'm wondering, as you wrote this book, I would imagine that you learned quite a bit about yourself in the process. Being an author myself, that's always I discover that, right? And I wonder if you could share a little bit about what you learned and how what you learned might also help other women, both Muslim and non-Muslim women, as you explored the issues that you described in your book.
Sure, sure. Look, writing about God for a believer, as I'm sure you and many listeners will agree, is different from writing about anything else. If you're a believer, writing about God there's a sense of responsibility that comes with it, and there's a sense of there's the humility of like, who am I to do this? But then I felt a calling, and I felt like, set aside the question of who am I, the help will come. And if it doesn't come, then you don't write. Mm-hmm. And if it comes, you pay close attention and you honor it. And so what I discovered is that when you write about God, you have to actually approach it as part of your spiritual practice. You cannot approach it as just another task or just another job. You cannot say, I'm going to wake up at 7 tomorrow, by 9 I'll be at my desk, I will work from 9 till 12, I will stop, take a lunch break, I will come back and I will write from 2 to 5 or whatever, go for my evening. You cannot approach writing about God in this way, because that's like saying I have all the answers. And you would be kind of trying to force fit things, which you should never do with such important subjects. So I understood very early on that this would be a spiritual exercise. I actually thought it might end up taking 10 years or so. I had no idea it was going to happen as quickly as it did, because of the interactive approach I took to it. So I would do it after prayer and meditation. If I got stuck on a verse, I would go sit and ask very specifically, I don't get this, it's not making sense to me, how does this tie in with that, etc. And lo and behold, I'm sure anyone who's meditated and prayed and nurtured a relationship with the divine will have experienced this at some point. Suddenly the ideas and the insights just kind of land in your head out of nowhere. And then you get up and yes, you're right. But if they don't come, I didn't force it. I let it lead me. And I will say one more thing. In this whole process, I had, for viewers who may not be familiar with this, but the Blessed Virgin, or Mother Mary, as many call her, is a very big figure in the Quran. And she is much loved, much revered. She is considered, literally, the Quran says she is the highest female creation, a human creation of mine, God tells us. So she is like the ultimate in terms of the feminine. And for whatever reason, I felt her presence and her support throughout. And I think that came about, I truly believe, because I had this emphasis on beauty in mind already. And of course, she exemplifies that in so many ways. She exemplifies complete surrender in the face of the absolutely unspeakable, unbearable, but steadfast, unquestioning, and she's just the ultimate feminine. And so I felt very much that she would lend me the subtle touch in my choice of wording, and my guidance, but it was also very clear to me, and I feel that came to me from her directly, that insight. But when it came to understanding the verses of the Quran themselves, I understood that I was to ask God directly. I was to sit and ask him directly. So it would be asking her for strength and help in writing, and finding the stamina and the strength and the courage also, but that I would be asking God directly for help in and I would always say this, please prevent me from inadvertently putting words in your mouth that do not belong there, that, don't let me do you wrong. So I became much closer to God as a result of the process, and my spiritual journey took on a whole new dimension. My spiritual practice, I should say, took on a whole new dimension.
Wow.
Yeah.
A beautiful answer, Lena. I did not know this. It's so beautiful.
I don't usually talk
It
about
touched
it,
my heart.
but I think it's time, to bring the spiritual into the mainstream.
I
because I
agree.
think this is what
Yes.
Islam has been robbed of
Yes.
in the
Yes.
last.
I totally agree. Absolutely. It was a very heart-touching, beautiful answer. And I know, Chris, you loved it because you're all about inspiration and not moving forward until you are inspired and have clarity. So I know Chris was just loving that.
Yeah, but I think this naturally happens when you surrender to the will of God, because
Yeah.
then it's not my will, it's not what I'm thinking, you know. It's the expression that, as you said, I don't know what but as you said, Lena, that when you open yourself up, then the answers come forth, and that those answers didn't come from your individuality, they came, those answers are so beautiful. There's no way you can take ownership of those, right? Right? It's just like, okay.
They're so beautiful, and sometimes they're so. I mean, it's not a. There's no logical way of having deduced them. It's just like
Yeah, right.
lateral shift. It's like a sudden jump.
Yeah.
And so this didn't come from me. It's just like landed in my head. It's because, and why? It's because I asked. Because I
Yes,
asked.
that's right.
We don't ask, we don't get an answer, right?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Knock and the door will open. Ask and it shall be given
That's
unto you.
right. That's right.
No, I just also wanted to comment that, I've been talking about this for a few years. The dance between the divine feminine and the divine masculine energy. I talked about the Jamal and the Jalal and all of that. So the way you describe the process of the writing of the book is very much a divine feminine way, right? It's about trust. It's about flow. So you didn't write until you were in the flow, right? All of that is very divine feminine. And then you mentioned Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam, Mother Mary, she's the epitome of embodiment of the divine feminine. So all ties in so beautifully.
And I have to say, if I can, just one final word about this. Surrender is difficult, and it's an ongoing effort. And I think it was very difficult for me in particular, despite my love for God and my intention to surrender, because I'm a very left-brained person. I am your mathematics and algebra and finance type of person. My brain is wired that way. It's just how I was born. So it took a lot to kind of nurture the other side of my brain so that it would open up and allow for insights that do not come through logic and sequential analysis, but that come from somewhere ineffable, somewhere, the mystery of God. And after all, he's got to keep something for himself, right? and surprise us with it, in this wonderful way. So it's an ongoing effort. The surrender thing is not an easy one.
Lena, thank you so much for taking this time with us. It's really, really a great honor to sit with you. You have thought so deeply about these issues, and when you speak, what I hear is the words of truth and beauty. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to meet you. I'm honored to have met Eram and to be doing this again with her. I'm so grateful, and thank you for your kind words. I hope it all made sense and will make sense to others as well.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. I am again deeply honored to bring some of these beautiful messages to the world. And to our viewers, if you feel moved by any of this, do let us know, especially if you want to help support this movement that has already started, and there's no stopping it, for the rights of Muslim women. Their voices will be heard. Do let us know. And if we can collaborate together, if we can work together in any way, that would also be really wonderful. So again, much, much love to both of you. Love you both very much. Thank you so much. And much love to our viewers as well. Bye-bye.